Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, The Crafted Studio Company. Today we're going to be decorating some sugar cookies for the holidays with my company Sugar Bee Cookies here in Western Canada. This is my Rustic Holiday Greens collection that is part of a workshop series and DIY take-home kits that people are purchasing for the holidays. If you don't have the kit, that's not a problem. You can bake your own cookies and make your own royal icing. I'll talk about the consistencies and what shapes we're doing, and you can follow along with the techniques. We're going to be working with a piping consistency royal icing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with the demonstration in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to talk about what the kits include in case you're one of the people that got one of the kits to watch this tutorial with. So we are going to be decorating this holiday wreath, a tree, sort of a pine branch, and then a snowflake with pine needle details. Each kit is going to come with a little cup and a paintbrush, and that's because we're going to be painting on sort of a glazed background for the cookies for that really rustic effect. You're going to get a needle tool or a scribe tool. These are a cookie decorator's best friend, so I highly recommend that you find one and invest in one. You can purchase these on Amazon easily enough for a low price, but you can also use a toothpick if you're just working with home supplies. And you can also go to Walmart to the knitting section, and they have sort of powder-coated metal knitting needles. Just get one with a nice thin tip, point to it, and that'll work great because it can be sanitized. Everybody is going to get 4 colors of icing. We're going to be working with a white, a red, a green, and a brown. And these are in a piping consistency. So it's a little bit thicker than a flood consistency or a medium consistency. And then everybody's going to get a total of 8 cookies. Now I'm only showing 4 here, but everybody gets 2 of each. We're going to do a tree, and you can use any shaped tree that you want to bake at home. And this is going to be for our pine needle branch. So this is a leaf cutter, but you can use any leaf cutter or any general shape that gives you that oblong kind of almost like a teardrop shape. You don't have to have all the bumps if you don't have that cutter. A round, and then a snowflake. And it doesn't have to be this snowflake shape. You can use any snowflake shape. Let's set all this stuff aside. And then all my workshop participants and kit purchasers are going to get this manual. And it's going to talk a little bit about the tutorial, a little bit about me, the kit supplies. We're going to go over royal icing. And I'm going to do a little demonstration here in a moment with the different consistencies and what they do for cookie decorating. Some coloring tips. You're going to get my sugar cookie recipe and royal icing recipe. But most importantly, they're going to come with step-by-step instructions for how to decorate these cookies. So you can follow along with this video, but you can also keep this for later so that you have it on hand and have step-by-step instructions to follow in future. So the royal icing that we're working with today, I've got them all pre-bagged. If you purchased a kit from me, you may see a little color separation. So you'll want to make sure you just massage your bag. That is the moisture, the water content separating from the sugar, and the colors affecting with it. So you just want to make sure that you give your bag a little massage and mix it back up. And you want to do that with every bag that you get. I would suggest doing this before you open and cut the tips, which we're going to talk about in a moment. If you've already pre-cut your bag and you forgot to do that, then just make sure you pinch off the end and massage that so no icing comes out the bottom. Now you may notice my colors are a little stronger in the piping bag than they are on the cookies themselves. That's because these are my sample cookies and I've just had them sitting out and not wrapped or sealed, and they will dry out and the color will fade over time. These are admittedly probably about a month old at this point. Sugar cookies don't go bad, they just go stale. All right, so we've massaged all our bags. So this kit is going to be working with piping consistency royal icing. The white may be a looser white, in more of a flood consistency. It really won't matter because we're going to be thinning it down one way or another in that little cup to paint on our cookies. So some of the kits may have a thicker one, some may have a thinner one. It just depends what I had on hand in the white. But royal icing consistencies. I will also just quickly say that you may want to make sure that you have a paper towel or a damp cloth that is clean, set aside. Royal icing consistencies. So royal icing, when you make it, most recipes are for a very thick consistency. This is even just a little bit thinner than some recipes out there, but this is how my recipe comes out. It has something falling over there, sorry. It has a sort of soft, stiff, between a soft and a stiff peak. And this is good for sort of building 3D structures like gingerbread houses, things like that. It's quite stiff. It's going to be very thick to pipe. What we want to do is we want to make a piping consistency. So a piping consistency, I'm talking a little fast. A piping consistency is about 20 to 22 seconds, and that's going to be good for piping details and lines and accents, and it's going to hold its shape. It also has a really nice quicker dry time than a looser icing. And the 20 to 22 seconds I mentioned, what that is when we add water to this, and you want to add just a little bit of water at a time, so I always keep mine in just a little squeeze bottle. Sugar reacts very easily to water, so you want to work with just a little bit at a time because it is easier to add more than it is to try and thicken it back up if you need to. The 20 to 22 seconds I mentioned is what we call a heel time. And what that means is that when you mark the top of your icing after it's settled, it takes about 20 to 22 seconds for that wound to heal up. And this is pretty close. I have many years experience, but I can see that this is sort of flooding and just a little bit and leveling itself out, but I still hold my shape. And that's exactly what we want for piping. So this is actually probably closer to a 26 second, but that's okay. It's pretty flexible. Doesn't have to be exact. So you can see I just shook the bowl and it leveled and flattened itself out. And when I draw, say, a tip of a knife through the surface, that should take 20 to 22, sometimes a little bit longer is okay, seconds to heal up and fix itself. You can use a stopwatch. You can just count in your head, whatever is easiest for you. Popping bubbles. And it should let you sort of level it out with just a little shimmy and a shake or a tap. So that is the icing consistency we're looking for this particular collection. Piping consistency. Just going to put my stuff aside here. That lid does not want to go on. There we go. You always want to make sure that you have your royal icing sealed up nice and tight. The air will affect it very quickly. It'll make it crust over, and you don't want those sort of dried bits of icing in your icing. Okay, so first things first, we are going to start with getting our bases on all our cookies, that white glaze. So we're going to need our cup. If you're doing this at home, just any little dish will do. And our paintbrush. And you want to cut open your icing bag. So for this one, we don't need to worry too much about how big we're cutting the opening. You just want to make sure you have just a nice little bit of the tip off. And squeeze your icing out into the cup. Now this one is one of my looser ones. It is not a piping consistency. This is much looser and thinner. So it will level itself and flood easier. If you have a thicker icing, you want to make sure that this one is quite thin once we pour it into the cup. So you want to add a little bit of water. And there's no right or wrong with this one. You can go quite thin. It's just the thinner you go with your icing, the more your cookie is going to show through underneath, and it's just going to be a thin little layer, which is our rustic look. It also keeps the cookie from getting too much icing on it. Some people don't like that really thick icing, and these details are more than enough for that sweet bite to go with the cookie. But you can see it just runs off your paintbrush or your spoon, whatever you're stirring with, and that's what we're looking for. So we're going to take the first cookie that we're going to decorate today is going to be this leaf shape pine branch one. And you can have any shape you want, but all we're going to do is get a good amount of this on your brush, and you're going to brush it on. And I'm going to brush and like pull right down over the edges. This can be a little bit messy, but messy is fine because we're going for rustic. And you can see as I pull the brush through, I'm leaving brush marks, but then it's going to smooth and level itself out because it's so thin. And you can go back in and just add a little bit if you notice places that are thin, but it really doesn't matter, and you don't need too much. The brush holds a lot. Now, with the paint brushes, if you're doing this at home without a kit, you want a synthetic brush that you can sterilize, and you want to make sure that it's never been used for anything other than food purposes. That is critical. So that one is done. And one of the main reasons why we're doing it this way with the glaze is because for the tutorials and the workshops, this will dry really quickly so that we can go on to the details on top. But also, like I mentioned, it doesn't put too much icing on the cookie, and it leaves a nice rustic look. If you know about the crackle technique, you can do that too. That would be a really great base for this. The next cookie that we're going to decorate is going to be the tree. So we want to make sure we glaze that one. And the reason why I am doing these in the order that we're decorating them is so that these dry in time for us to move to the next one. You want to make sure that you're not holding your cookie too hard. You don't want to snap it. Quite often my cookies are quite soft, so you also don't want to put pressure in a specific spot that will make it bend and then crack. So just hold it carefully. You can do this on a surface if you want to. Just make sure that the surface you're working on is clean and a wipeable surface or a placemat of some sort. You can work on your tray if you have a tray. You can see this is a bit messy, and that's fine. You just go in and clean that up. And I'm just painting it on, and I'm pulling it down over the sides. The brush kind of sweeping down off the side. And the reason for that is because the icing's always going to pull back a little bit. And I want to get right to the edge. And that's how you can see some of these areas where it kind of pulls back from the edge. So I'm coming right down off the edge. All right, so that's our tree. And this is important to have your cloth in between so that you clean your fingers. The next cookie on our list is going to be this snowflake. You can use any snowflake shape, as I mentioned. Now, you can see as well by doing a glaze, your icing is going to go a lot further. So you don't have to make a really large batch. Sometimes being able to stretch out your icing is really, really important, and having tips and tricks and ways to do that. I'm just going to clean that up. Having tips and tricks on how to make things stretch is really good. Especially here in our area right now, we're going through a sugar shortage. The most local sugar factory that supplies all our chains is on strike, and it's causing rotating shortages in powdered sugar and regular sugar and brown sugar. Most of the stores here going into the holidays have a limit per one per bag per customer, which is not good for holiday bakers. Luckily, I stocked up from wholesale earlier in the season, so I'm good. Okay, so the next cookie that we're going to do, I'm actually going to set these aside. You just want to move them carefully. So the last cookie we want to do is the round one, as that's the last cookie that we're going to decorate today. And I'm just working it around and around, and I'm pulling off the side. This goes fairly quick. And if you're anything like me, I'm a bit OCD, legit. So sometimes I can hiccup on trying to make it perfect. But I also find that a lot of new people learning how to work with icing will fuss a lot with the individual stages, because you're trying to make it look perfect as you can and learn. And really, for this technique, it's not needed. We want rustic. We want imperfectly perfect. Okay. So that is getting our glazes on. And that's all that's needed. We're going to just make sure our surface is nice and clean. And then we're going to move to decorating our sets here. So the first one we're working on is this pine branch one. I can see at some point I mucked up probably another cookie that had the same color on it, and I got it too close. That's okay. So our glaze is still wet, so we may want to leave this for about 5 minutes and then come back and start decorating. So this is a great time where you can kind of get organized or prep everything, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to prep our icing bags. So we already cut open our white, which I've set aside. And we've already massaged our bags, but if you haven't, make sure you give it a good massage. Mix that color all back together if it's separated a bit. And then what we're going to do is I'm just going to squeeze the excess out of the end so that we have something to work with. And I'll try and get nice and close to the camera here. You'll need a pair of scissors. So the way I cut my icing bags is we want to cut just a very little bit off of them because we want nice fine lines when we pipe. So the way I do that is I pinch it, just a little snippet of it between my thumb and my forefinger, and I snip that off. And what you should have, let's see if I have a piece of parchment here. And what you should have is a nice, when you give it a good squeeze, this is why you need a cloth. You need to clean your tips and your needle tool in between everything. When you give it a squeeze, you should be able to get a nice thin line. When you squeeze it consistently, it should just kind of easily pour out. If it's really hard to get out, then your icing is either A, too thick, or B, you need to cut just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit more off that tip. And when I say tiny, I mean just a hair. Always go in small increments when we're working with these tipless bags. So we're going to massage and cut our other colors. You kind of want to make sure you know where that plastic piece is snipping off to, which is why you find I'm dropping my bag back down to the counter when I'm cutting, because I don't want it to fly into a wet cookie. And our green. So something to note about icing colors, especially green, is when you color royal icing, the color gets stronger over time. It also gets stronger as it dries on a cookie. So you can actually go a much lighter color than you think when you're mixing your greens and blues, and the color will deepen over time. Even black. A lot of people try and add way too much color to their black, and then when you bite into the icing later on, it leaves all that black icing on your lips and tongue. It's not needed. You actually just need a gray icing, sort of a darker gray, and then if you let it rest for about 6 hours or 8 hours, that color will become much darker and blacker as it sits. So I'm just gonna check. So that's a nice thin line. The red one is not as important to get a thin line because we're only using it for the berry accents in this tutorial. And I'm gonna just cut just a tiny little bit more off that one, because this one I'm gonna be wanting to make nice round balls like that. Okay. So that's our icing colors. We're done with the white now, so I'm gonna sit him aside. But this is a good time to get a little bit of practice in if you want. We're still waiting for that to just crust over a little bit more. I'm going to get some of these blobs off of here. And just some of the techniques that we're going to be using today for this cookie, and to get you comfortable with the icing bag if you've never used one before. You always want to hold the icing bag, the thickest part, in the palm of your hand, and that's going to give you the most control for squeezing and angling your wrist. And quite often you'll want to make sure that you're using your other hand to hold your wrist or the bag, and it's going to give you control. I'm going to try and not do that too much in the camera view for you, but that is something that you want to practice with. And when you're working with icing, you want to just squeeze a little bit and touch the surface, and at the same time you want to lift up, follow a line, and drop down and release the pressure and connect the icing back to the surface. Lifting up as you work with outlines and detail work is so important. It's actually letting the icing, oh, that one broke. Letting the icing fall into place is what you want. You're going to get the cleaner lines. If you try and draw directly on your surface or close to your surface, it's not as clean a line. You don't have enough time to correct any issues that are happening as the icing's coming out. See this one? I can actually wiggle around a little bit and come back and correct and fix the line even though I was shaky. It's just going to give you a lot more control. So learn the lift and draw with the motion of your wrist versus drawing like a pencil on paper. So the technique that we're going to be using today for pine needles is we're going to, oh, I broke again, but you can see I can go back over the break and connect it all again. And the beauty of these details that we're working with today is it's very forgiving. You can make a mess, and honestly, it's going to all look great in the end. I'm going to create a little line, and I'm going to just create little fan marks And I'm just going to be layering. I can even layer over top of each other, so that's why it's okay to have a bit of a mess or breaks in your lines. And I'm just creating a fan of pine needles, and I'm just going as thick as I want to get those layers or cover up any places that there was a break. And that's how we're going to be doing this one. For the other cookies, you can do this on a plate, or you can do this on a piece of parchment paper or wax paper. For the other cookies, we're going to be practicing this technique today, and that's going to be creating a center line. And we're almost going to be going like a back and forth. And you can do this one a little bit closer to the surface, almost more like drawing. We're going to be creating this squiggle pattern on one side of your line. And then you're going to be coming back and doing that same squiggle pattern, nice little short bursts, back on the other one. And if there's spots that are bare, you can actually layer over top. You can also just do individual lines if you want. So you could create a line. That one was a wonky line, but that's okay. You could just create individual little short lines, which is a great technique, but it's going to probably take a little more finesse and comfort with the piping bag if you're a beginner. So this little squiggle zigzag is our best way to create all these little pine needle, like this, sprigs, versus the branch needles, which is this. So that's just a little bit of practice you can do while you're waiting for your glazes to firm up a bit. And I can see now this one is still a little bit shiny, but it is workable. You just want to make sure you don't touch the surface. And the reason why we want this to crust over is that we don't want our icing that we're doing on top to melt into the icing and spread. So you need this crusted over a little bit to stop that from happening. So we're going to be starting with our brown, and all we're going to be doing is creating stem up the center. You can use your needle tool in that glaze, and you can lightly just kind of draw yourself a guide if you want, but it's not important to do because this is rustic. And we're going to be piping several lines just to get a thickness, and you can see my line is breaking a bit, and that's okay because, as I said, rustic. And I'm going to be probably doing 5 or 6 lines. I'm just building up a little bit of depth. And I'm not worrying about the top too much because I'm going to be covering that with more pine needles. And that's all you need to do. You can make it thicker if you want and layer it more, not a problem. We're going to then go in with our green. And starting about here, I know you can't see it because of the details that we put on top with the berries, but starting, you know, I'm kind of considering where the lines are or the bumps on the shape of the cookie are. Where that one is where I'm going to start. And I'm actually going to start in the center just to give myself a guide. And I'm just going to start squeezing and fanning out. Now this is going to take time, and I'm going to be doing it a little bit quicker for the sake of tutorial. So just pause the video wherever you need to and work on your cookie. This is a very forgiving technique for stopping and starting if you need to go tend to something, or if you're baking and need to go deal with the oven and things like that. And you can see I'm just going back in and I'm layering on top because we're working with a piping consistency. It doesn't all blend together. And then I'm going to go in and pick a couple of other places that I want to create more of those sort of pine needle clusters. You don't have to do this, but this is just going to give you a little visual as to where I'm going to be placing things. And that's where I'm going to work from. And you can do lines from top to bottom or from stem to top if you want. I would recommend from stem to top because that way when you get excess icing all clustered together, it's going to be kind of in theme for how I think I need to cut just a little bit more off my tip. I'm having a lot of breaking happening. That's better. There we go. Oops, that broke. You can also kind of go back and forth if you want to, like up and down, little V's. But I wouldn't do all of them that way because you want those individual thin branches. And if you have any areas that need cleaning up, just go in with your needle tool, make sure you have your cloth handy, and clean them up. So I'm just making a guide on the outside of where I want to work. I've already got my center guide. This is the kind of project that you get really quiet with and just kind of zone out with. And you could leave it like that. You don't have to layer anything if you don't want to. It's all about personal taste and how you see the world. Because nature is, as I mentioned earlier, perfectly imperfect. So you can do whatever you want. If you get curling up on your tip, quite often it just means that there's a little tiny crisp of a dried piece of icing or something in there, or maybe powdered sugar or meringue powder that didn't blend in properly. So you just use your cloth and squeeze that out. And move your cookie around as you need to for the comfort of your hand. I'm trying my best to do this under a camera setup, and it's really hard because I'm visually quite far away from my cookies. Normally I'd be right over top of the cookie looking down at it, and I'm doing this from a funny angle, so I'm also trying to make sure that you guys can see what I'm doing. Okay, and then I think I'm going to do this one. And you can see I'm holding my piping bag. It's steadying my hand, especially when we're dealing with a thicker piping consistency, because it is hard on your wrists and your hands. And I do have problems with my tendons and hands, so you want to make sure you give yourself a break and a rest in between. Like I said, this is a very forgiving technique to just kind of pick up and go. If you need to let this sit for a bit, you can always come back in and do more after. Okay, see I blocked that. Go in with your needle tool, just pick it up. And then you can come back in and pipe just over top of any of those areas that didn't pick up well. All right, and you can take a look, and if there's any places that you don't like or that you feel could just use a little attention, just add 1 or 2 lines, but keep it simple. And I can see this is a little thick in here, but I'm going to let that be because that's already starting to crust. And if I try and pick it up, I'm actually going to pick up a whole bunch of it because it's drying together already. And this is where the details on top come in handy, is because we can kind of hide any of those areas. If you have any particularly larger bare spots, you can go in and create just little, like a thinner little cluster. I quite like the placement of this right now, so I'm going to let it be. If you want to go in and add a little more of your brown, you can, to thicken up that stem. It's probably not needed, so again, keep it simple. Only do 1 or 2 lines because we're going to come in with our red and add some berries. We're also going to probably use the brown and add kind of like little seeds, as if it's, you know, pine needles right on the branch, because those seeds, that little textural mark just adds a little bit to the cookie and also hides our areas that we don't like. So for the berries, I'll just show you on a piece of paper. To squeeze berries, we're going to touch our cookie, or sorry, our piping bag right to the icing and lift up just a tiny little bit as we're squeezing. And we're going to stay in place and squeeze a ball and almost press it down with the tip of the icing. I don't know if you guys can hear the neighbor's dog barking, but she's going nuts right now. We live right near a dog park. And use your needle tool to fix anything that you need to, if there's any sort of peaks. So squeeze and lift. You don't want to make these too big, because what can happen is they can collapse and crater and create holes in them when your icing is drying. So here you can see I've used a couple of different clusters and different sizes. I'm going to start up here where I don't like the connection, and I'm going to create 1 berry, and I'm going to offset it. You don't want to go too close together, because if they bleed together, they might kind of melt into each other and become one big blob. So you want to make sure you leave a space in between. I'm going to create another one. I'm going to do a trio. And I'm just going to fix any of those little peaks that I'm getting. I'm just going to touch them down, tap them out with my needle tool. So often when I'm working with berries or decorative details on trees and pine stuff for the holidays, I do them in clusters of 1, 2, and 3. It's just a visual design thing. So here, even though this one's a bit different, I'm going to do a single, and then I think here I'm going to do a double, then I'm going to come down here and I'm going to go off the side a bit, and I'm going to do another trio. You don't have to follow this exactly. You can do whatever you think looks good. And just for a little bit of added decorative detail, anywhere that I only have a couple, I'm actually going to come back in right where all the pine needles kind of meet around the berries and on the stem. I'm going to just add a couple of really tiny little brown dots. Just almost like it's little seed clusters. You can do a couple on top if you want to. Hide those little areas. There's no right or wrong. But that's your pine branch. It doesn't have to be completely full to be beautiful. And quite often, if you have a cookie that looks simple, don't do much more to it unless you see it with the whole collection as it pulls together, because quite often you want more detailed cookies and some less detailed cookies for a collection to really be cohesive. But that's your pine branch. So we're going to set him aside, and we're going to move on to our second cookie, which is our tree. And I just put my finger into my icing as I move the cookie, so be very careful. That's okay, because we're going to be covering that up, but you can just, if it's still damp, you can just touch, sort of tap it, almost like you're stitching it. If you need to hold the cookie with something, you can just put your needle tool onto the cookie to stabilize it, but that's okay. Try not to do that, but we'll work with it. So again, we're going to go in with our brown first, and we're going to be creating a couple of stem lines up the center. But you can see in this one, I almost taper to a thinner point and thicker at the bottom for a trunk. So all I'm doing is piping, broke my line, piping up. And I'm going to create sort of my outside marker and create a V, and I'm breaking my thing. So that means this is just a little too thin for the thickness of icing we're using. Okay, there we go. Yes, if it's hard to squeeze out and keep consistent, just go back and take off a tiny little bit. And I'm just layering, not too many times, maybe between 6 and 9 times, because we're going to be covering a lot of that up. That's just sort of to give us the sense of a trunk. So for this tree, we're going to be doing more of those sprigs I talked about rather than the sprays. That's the zigzag one. So I'm going to start at the top, and I'm actually just going to layer right over top of my trunk, and I'm going to create myself a short little line. It's just my guideline, and I'm going to be going in and doing that zigzag technique, and as I come to the top, I'm going to curl around so that I have a peak at the top. You can kind of go in and add a couple extra little lines if you want to. If you find it easier to just do the piped lines like that, you can do that. You don't have to do the zigzag thing. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to create one there. So I'm looking at the shape of my cookie. So whatever tree shape that you have. And at the bottom sort of section of each one, I'm going to go back in and fix that. I'm going to sort of go upwards towards that. Having trouble with this angle. You can see I'm going quite low on this section. There's going to be a lot of bare section there, but that's because I'm going to do a bigger schmoosh. Technical word, bigger zigzags, but I'm going to be layering extra little branches in between. So we're going to do these ones first, and then we're going to look at any bare spaces we have and fill those in with much smaller sprigs. And I'll see if I can explain here. Let's see if this is on view for the camera. So we're going to be doing all those areas here, but then after we're going to go in with tiny little ones if there is space to do it. Because it is a tree, we want to fill it out like a tree. So work whichever side is easiest for you. You can overlap. You can come right back around the top if you want to, like I just did there for your zigzag, or you can do one side at a time like this. Whatever you like. You can go in and add lines if you need to. You don't have to do this. You don't have to make it super thick. You can just have thin lines if you want and still see the little bit of the cookie underneath. And as you get further down this tree, you're going to want to go a little bit bigger in your zigzagging, like wider. Okay. Clean the tip as you go if you need to. I'm just going a little bit wider with my zigzag back and forth. I'm just gonna, I like the contrast of the layers, so I always find I tend to go add just a couple more lines. It's almost like the zigzag base is just to get you a really easy base. I can see in here I don't quite like the way everything's sitting. This is all going to come down to your personal preference of what you think looks good. I'm going even wider. And you can see I'm almost holding my piping bag at an angle. And you'll find sometimes one side is easier to do than another. It's just all about the angles. is a very loud day in my neighborhood. I don't know how much is picking up on my camera mic, but loud cars, loud machinery, loud dogs. Okay. And if you see areas you don't like, go in with your needle tool and you can almost draw through the icing if they've kind of blended together. And that's usually from you pushing down into the icing too much or adding too many layers like I just did. So you can actually use this to draw and separate it back out. And you can go right over top of the trunk if you want to. Now I'm going to come back down over the trunk on this one a bit. And same here. I just think the effect is a little bit better to cover some of the trunk. Okay. Bottom ones, I'm making these quite big. Just random little lines to add a little texture. Any that are particularly askew, I'm going to just draw through, pick up, clean up. This one you might have a little trouble seeing. I think my wrist might be in the way. There we go. You also may notice that your icing is getting warmer in your hand, so it's going to flow a bit differently. If you find it's getting too warm and too thin and starting to blend into each other instead of keeping sort of defined lines, you may want to just give the piping bag a break. You can pop it in the fridge for a moment if you want, but it's going to thicken it up quite a bit and make it stiffer to control. Okay, and I'm actually going to come back down into the center here a little bit more. This is where you can kind of see where you want to do, if you want to add a little bit more. And I can see I want to add some tiny sprigs in here because this looks like a bare bones tree. So I'm going to create just a little one there. And then I'm going to see, and you can actually layer right over top of other ones that are there. I'm going to add a little tiny one there. And I'm going to go right over top of that branch a little bit. And you can see I'm losing my definition a bit. So I'm going to use my needle tool to just kind of pull it in, but that's also somewhere that I'm going to focus on some berries or something, or decorations. I'm just going to extend this one a little bit longer, so you can see you can go back in and do that. And if you find you're losing your definition, just add one line down the middle. You'll find it pulls it all back in visually when you start adding more stuff. I'm going to create a tiny little one here. I'm going to go right over top of this branch. I'm going to do that line down the middle. And I'm going to do a little one here. And this may be where you start thinking, oh, what have I done? I've ruined my cookie. I do that all the time. But honestly, you can go back in and just add a couple of little definitions, very, very minimal, right over top of that branch. And you'll find it pulls it all together, like those lines I was talking about, like this. It's about giving your eye a place to flow when too much is going on. And that's going to be another place that I focus some berries because I don't particularly love that, but I needed to fill the space. So it's going to be in the detail works. I cover some of it up. And I don't think I'm going to do one there. I'm going to leave that there because trees are kind of like that in nature. And now we're going to go in with our decorations. Now you can do this any way you want. You can create the clusters of berries like I've done here. I've done it in both white and red. Now the white, if you've cut off too much of a tip, you'll want to be careful because we don't want to create really big balls, but I'll figure that out in a moment with you. But I'm going to just pick a couple places. See, that was a bare spot and now it's not. And there. I'm going to work on my little trios first. I do tend to like trios. I'm going to do one here. And then I'm going to go back in with some sort of, maybe not singles, double sections. Well, that's going to be another trio. I'm going to add just a couple more. Now you can do this as if they're berries, or you could do this as if it's a tree decoration. So you could do sort of garlands. You could do like dots all in a string. But I'm going to go in and tap, clean off your needle tool as needed. I'm going to go down and tap all those little peaks down. A good tip and trick if you have peaks on little dots and stuff that you're doing and you're finding that it's fussing and still sticking and with your needle tool not tapping, let it crust maybe a minute or two and press your finger into a little bit of powdered sugar or cornstarch, and you can just tap it down with your finger as long as your hands are nice and sanitized and clean. So this is just basically like decorating a tree. You're just going to pick a few places that you want your decorations. I think I'm going to leave it at that. You could go in with the brown and make little seeds like we did on the other ones, or you can use your white. Now this is a particularly very loose white. It's just what I had on hand. Everyone with a kit or making the icing at home should start with a thicker icing. And I'm just going to touch a few places. And I find that this just gives a little bit of contrast. My icing is so loose, it's just coming out of the bag on its own. So that's why I'm being very careful here. Okay, and there you guys have it. You have your tree. See all those little areas that you maybe didn't like before? All start making sense when you have the whole thing together. Okay. So the next cookie we're going to work on is our snowflake. Now, for the sake of the course, I picked a snowflake that, and you can see he baked a little wonky. That's fine. That won't matter. I don't know if you can see that, but that one kind of curves down a bit. You can pick any snowflake shape you want. Just make sure that you keep it simple with the pine branches. This one I liked for this tutorial simply because it has sort of definitive thin arms, but that's not needed. And we're going to just do the same thing we did with the tree. We're going to come in with our brown. We're going to come in with our brown and we're going to create a line, and we're going to do that eventually for every single one. But I'm going to work on just one branch at a time. And this is going to be sort of a mix between that zigzag, but we're going to keep them fairly consistent because we're going longer. You'll find quite often you want to start thicker at the bottom and get narrower at the top. You can do whatever you want. But I like these to kind of be just long, thin branches. And you can go in and make a couple of the brown marks at a time. I wouldn't suggest doing all of them because you're not going to be working as quickly as this. You're going to be taking a little bit more time, I'm guessing. And you don't want all those brown lines to really harden up because it can pull off when you're working on it. So I would only do a couple at a time so that they stay a little bit wet. And I'm going to come in. And if you want to leave a little bit of that brown showing, that's fine. Like you can see there, I left that. I quite like that. So you don't have to overlap right on top of it. You can kind of go right up to it. And you're going to overlap anywhere that you have icing from before. I'm not worried about the center section too much because I'm actually going to be adding some berries and stuff in the center there. And I can always go back in and add more, but you'll find as you add more and more of these stems and branches, they're going to overlap at that center, and you'll end up with quite a bit of icing there. So just be mindful of that. So you can see I'm going faster through this than I did on the other ones because I want to just get these all down and see my placement of my greens and how they're all working together in this shape. And then I'm going to go back in and add go back in and add anything I feel needs more definition. Like here. And this is where you can add just a couple of individual lines for texture, definition, whatever you desire. Anywhere that's overlapped, I'm just kind of fixing up. Oops. Right there. And it is very possible to do too much here, so just keep it simple. Okay. Oh. You always have to keep in mind that you're going to be adding stuff to this in the final details. Is that. So I'm going to be going in with my red, and I'm going to just create a nice cluster, making sure they offset so that they don't bleed together, because they are going to kind of level out a little bit depending how loose your icing is. And if you don't like the size of them, you can kind of go back in, press your icing into the center and just add a little more and push it out. Where the icing will push itself out, I mean. You can also use the tip of your bag to kind of tap down any areas. Now on this one I have some of those seeds. I didn't particularly love how I did this one, but I'm just going to add a couple clusters, various places. Just for that little hint of it. But I think in this one I may go in. There's no right or wrong. Oops. I got dried icing on my. I'm going to add a little bit of my white too for some white berries. Now I don't know if I like that. I think I liked it the way it was before. So if you've done that, what I would suggest is letting those, or if you want to change something that you put on, I would let it crust over a little bit before doing this, but I'm going to just pick some of that off. If you let it dry just a little bit, you'll find it picks off in one clump. Right now it's blending into my green, and I'm picking up some of my green that I didn't want to do. But there is always a way to fix cookies that you didn't like, or details that you don't like. And anywhere that I've left sort of that white blob, I'm just going to go over and cover. We're going to hide our indiscretions here. And that's how you fix mistakes. That's why I love this kind of technique. It's just so forgiving. And I'm just going to leave him like that. Nice and simple. You've got your snowflake spray bouquet, I guess. Okay, and the last cookie we're going to be working on is our wreath. What I love about this one is quite often doing rounds can be very tedious because it's hard to get a perfect round, but we don't need that in this one. You can use your scribe tool if you want to. We're going to start with our brown, and you could create yourself just a little guide mark in the glaze because the glaze is still soft. You don't need to do this unless you really feel you have to. And we're going to pipe, and this is where we're going to really find that lift and let the icing drop and fall into place come in handy. So we're going to squeeze and touch and lift once it's connected. And you're going to follow that guide mark around. Generally, you want to go slow. You can see how high I'm lifted off. But I'm going to overlap and I'm going to come around, and this is why we don't have to worry about perfection. We're kind of creating that tangled wreath look. I'm kind of trying to go on the outside and the inside a little bit. And I'm going to go around between 3 and 5 times. If your line breaks, that's not a problem. You can just pick up wherever you want and add a little bit of lines. And I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, but that lifting and letting the icing fall, if I notice I'm off a little bit, it gives me time to wiggle back into place where I want to be. Now don't fuss with this too much, like I'm doing. You just want the idea of it. You can actually see here I have 2 different colors going on. My cookie dropped and broke. This whole piece broke off. This all broke off. All of these broke off when I had a mishap earlier. So I quickly fixed it as best I could just for the visual. Okay, so you can let this crust and rest a minute if you wanted to before you moved to the green. But I'm going to find sort of anywhere, so you can see the shape is a little bit askew and wonky. I'm just going to find where I like my top and bottom to be. The bottom we're going to be covering up, so I think this is going to be my bottom. And I'm going to be creating a guide mark for 2 sprigs. I'm not going to worry too much about the middle. Again, we're going to be covering it up with berries. And I'm going to be coming in with that same zigzag or individual needles, whatever you like, right over top of the brown. And I'm kind of tapering up. I'm bigger at the bottom and getting more narrowed and tapered at the top. And I don't like how that turned out, but you'll watch. I'm just going to come in and fix that up, and I'm going to let it sit for a minute, and then I'll take a peek at it. And that's where I'm going to come in. Just add a little more definition. Now you can leave it with just the 2 sprigs if you want to. I have extra ones here. You'll want to make sure that your icing is a thicker piping consistency if you're going to pipe more on top and layer it, because you don't want it to blend all together. But I'm going to add just another little one there, and I'm probably going to just see where I'm at. I'm going to go right over top of that one. And remember what we did with the tree? Because the eye starts losing definition, I'm going to add lines on the individual sprigs just to give the eye some flow. And I'm actually just going to leave it at the 3. I like the fullness. I like the way it is. You can work around up if you wanted to. But this is when I'm going to add my accent berries. If your icing starts falling like mine did because I was working on top of a section and then it fell down to a space underneath, just pick it up as best you can. Pull it off anything that it attached to that you don't want there. See, it's attaching to my green. I'm just going to disconnect that there. You can kind of carefully go back in and fix your green if you need to. Or you can add more berries or whatever you want. And I'm going to make these ones a little bigger. When doing any design work, art stuff, working in threes is generally, or offset numbers, is generally the best visual for the eye. So that's why you'll quite often find me working in clusters of threes, ones, and then often just putting in a little bit of twos, but you just want to offset it. You don't want everything to be exactly the same. And I'm going to use my brown, creating those little tiny dots for seed clusters. I'm going to go in between my berries a bit. You want to cluster some, you want to separate some. And you can go in with your white if you want to and add some white berries too. I didn't like it when I did it on the snowflake, but I kind of want to on this so that it matches my tree. So I think I'm going to add, well, this is really loose. So this is why you don't want to work with too loose of an icing. It'll just blob everywhere. But I'm going to leave it like that. And you can see I just did 3. Just visually, if it's too perfect on either side, the eye doesn't have movement to move around. But that's your wreath. So guys, today you decorated your wreath, your snowflake, a tree, and a branch. We learned a couple of different pine needle techniques. And it's a beautiful collection. It would make a great gift. And I really want you guys to give yourself a clap or a pat on the back. Well done. Thank you for following. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and there will be more coming. There's a set of 4 tutorials over the holiday season. So be sure to watch for the links in the description below. Bye.